Hello guys, so have you ever asked yourself the question, what is the highest weapon damage you can possibly get in this game? Well, that's a question I have asked myself many times, and I have never gone and actually put together in-game the highest weapon damage spec possible that I could. So today guys, I have got a few builds for you, and they are maximum weapon damage builds. So the first build that we're going to take a look at is a maximum weapon damage build that has a flat stat value. Then we're going to take a look at a weapon damage build that can get super high weapon damage using a bunch of different proc sets, and then we're going to take a look at a fun little hybrid build at the end. I hope that you guys are excited to see what these builds look like. It was really cool to put them together on the PTS. If you guys like this video, hit that like button. If you guys are new here, hit that subscribe button, and without further ado, let's check these specs out. Alright guys, so let's jump into the first spec that we're going to take a look at here, and this is going to be the consistent value maximum weapon damage build. So this is going to be the consistent amount of weapon damage that we can pull on a spec without having a lot of super conditional buffs. We are going to have a couple conditional buffs. Our minor brutality is going to be coming from our poison, and we have the master bow, but both of those are very easy and reliable to proc, so I'm going to include them in the flat damage buffed weapon damage build. So let's take a look at this build when we fully buff it up. And as you guys can see, fully buffed, we get up to 8,120 weapon damage. So a massive amount of weapon damage to pull consistently on this build. Now, something I did want to mention is that value is actually inflated by about 500 weapon damage thanks to our Master's Bow. So how are we hitting such a huge amount of consistent weapon damage on this build? Well, let's take a look at the gear that we're running on this spec to do it. Before we jump into the gear, though, I did want to mention that we need that Warrior Mundus. The Warrior Mundus is going to be another source of weapon damage, and of course this can be buffed by the Divine's trait on our gear, so that's going to be important to stacking this. We are a Dark Elf or an Orc on the new PTS patch. Dark Elf and Orc both get a 258 base bonus to their weapon damage, so that is why you need to be Dark Elf or Orc if you want to push the highest amount of damage possible on a build like this. The food that we use is not too terribly important because you cannot gain additional weapon damage from the food, so if you wanted to take a build like this and make it a little bit more usable and practical, I would recommend running a food for sustain here. So let's take a look at the gear that we're using here, and as you guys can see, the first set we've got is the Balorg and Kenna combo, and this is great. The single one pieces are both going to give us base weapon damage in the one piece, just great to give us that flat amount of stat that we stack up on this build. Now, Hunding's Rage is the next 5-piece that we have, and I actually mulled over a lot of different set combinations using a combination of 3 and 4 pieces, etc., in order to try to get the highest weapon damage possible, but Hunding's Rage actually came in as the best option all around for increasing your best weapon damage in this 5-piece slot here. I couldn't even find a better option to trade it out in a combination of other pieces. And I did want to mention that I picked Hunding's Rage here. However, you could go with another set here that won't appear on your stat page. For the sake of this video, I went Hunding's Rage because we wanted to have a huge stat page. But you could always go for something like Automaton, which is going to give you a lot more damage. It just won't show up on your stat page as high as Hunding's Rage does. And then, of course, Hunding's Rage gives you that crit. Really nice all around as a 5-piece set, but for the sake of this video, we picked it just for that flat weapon damage value. Now, I could have picked some other sets here as well that also had a kind of proc to them, something like Senchei's Bite, which would give us a little bit more weapon damage. However, it requires that dodge roll, so I didn't want to use any of the proc sets outside of the Master's Bow if I could help it for the flat stat version of this build. Now, taking a look at the jewelry that we have, we've got 3 Drow Kingslayer. Now, Drow Kingslayer is a very interesting set because it is very unique in the game. It is the only set in the game that gives you a 2 and 3 piece weapon damage, and that's what's going to make it uniquely good for what we're trying to do here. Outside of this, I think this would be really great to use this 3-piece on something like a hybrid that uses Palinals for stacking. But for the sake of this build, this is our best bet because we can pair it with a 2-piece weapon for more weapon damage. So we get a total of 390 weapon damage out of our Drow Kingslayer and our 7th Legion combo here. And I think that's a fairly high value to get, especially when we're comparing it to something like Hunding's Rage, which gives us that flat value. Now, the weapons, like I had mentioned, are, of course, 7th Legion. And this is just to give us a little bit of weapon damage on the 2-piece. Any 2-piece weapon damage will work for this slot here. The important thing is that we are dual wield and we are Nirnhoned. I cannot stress this enough. If you want to stack your maximum stat as high as possible, dual wield is the best option by far for stacking weapon damage, and that is simply because of the dual wield expert passive. Increase your weapon damage by 6% of offhand's weapon damage. So this is a double whammy because our main hand is going to be, of course, Nirnhoned to give us a huge amount of flat damage, but the Nirnhoned offhand weapon is going to push even further weapon damage for this build. And then it doesn't really matter what you go for, swords, daggers, or axes here. The swords will give you the higher tooltips, the daggers will give you the crit, and the axes will give you the bleed, and the mace for the penetration. But for the sake of stacking weapon damage, it doesn't really matter what weapons you go for here. It just is very important that you have that dual Nirnhoned. And then for the bow, guys, we have got the Infused Master's Bow with the weapon spell damage enchant, and then, of course, when we use the poison injection, we'll get 300 additional weapon damage. Now, something I want to mention is that the way we have this build set up, in order to push the weapon damage it does, we have a 71% increased value on our weapon damage. So something like the Master's Bow at 300 damage, that's actually 500 weapon damage coming out of that. And then the base weapon and spell damage at 452, that's going to be well over 800 weapon damage. So this is a really, really, really effective way to stack the weapon damage on this build, and we'll get a little bit more into how we got that 71% value when we take a look at the skills that we're using on this spec as well. And then I did want to mention something about the traits outside of the weapons here too. We are full infused with weapon damage on the jewelry, very important yet again for that biggest stack possible, and then all the gear is divines with max stam enchants. The enchants don't really matter, we just went max stam to give us more stamina damage because we are weapon damage. However, the divines trait is what we really want here for that increased weapon damage off our Warrior Mundus. And then finally, guys, the potion on our dual wield bar is the Brutality Draining Potion, and this is very important because it gives us minor brutality. Now, this won't be up all the time, and I know this was supposed to be the flat stat weapon damage build. However, this is the only way for a stamina Templar to get minor brutality, so that is why we're running the poison here. And yeah, it just gives us that last little bit of weapon damage on this build. 10% increased weapon damage is a really nice value, so the minor brutality is well worth, I think, as well. Alright, so now we're going to take a quick peek at the ability line just on our main bar, which is our kind of buffed up bar. The bow bar that we run, the only important skill we have here is really poison injection and maybe race against time to give us that damage buff. But outside of that, you just pretty much put your heals and backup skills on this bar. The front bar, in order to push the weapon damage that we do, we had to run a very specific front bar, and that is full Fighter's Guild with biting jabs. And there's good reason for this. So the full Fighters Guild is important, of course, because each Fighters Guild ability is going to give us a 3% bonus to our total weapon damage. And then on top of it, we get another 5% bonus to our weapon damage for going for the Flawless Dawnbreaker morph on our Dawnbreaker here. So in the end, we get a 20% bonus to our weapon damage on the front bar for slotting every single Fighters Guild skill. Now, is this practical for a fight? Not really. Maybe if you were to play kind of a gank spec, then it would be a little bit more practical, but this kit is not going to be the best all-around kit for combat. It is not terribly bad. I mean, the Fighters Guild skills, at least we have a spammable and a pretty powerful dot. But for the most part, this is a show kit, and this is not something that you would normally use in the course of combat outside of just pushing those really high jab numbers. So we have gone with Silver Leash, Ring of Preservation, Evil Hunter, and Lightweight Beast Trap. It doesn't really matter what morphs you pick here because, like I said, these are just here for show. And then finally, we've got the Biting Jabs. This is also important for that little bit of crit damage bonus on our Spear Bar. It's not something we can see in the stat page, but if you did want to take a fancy build like this and see what the jabs could hit, it's going to hit hard. So that's why we've got the jabs here, and of course it gives us a little bit of buff coverage too. So I did want to quickly go over where all our sources of weapon damage percent stacking are coming from. So we've got a total of 20% from our Fighters Guild skill tree here. Our medium armor is going to give us an additional 15% for a total of 35%. Our Templar Adric Wrath passive is going to give us an additional 6%, putting us up to 41%. And then finally, our Major and Minor Brutality is 30% additional, putting us up to that 71% increased value on our weapon damage on this build. And that is how we're getting that super huge stack on this spec. Alright guys, so taking a look at the next spec, there you saw it, 10,200 weapon damage. Now this spec here is reliant on a lot of procs to be going off at the same time in order to push that massive value, and we'll get into those procs in the gear here, but that 10,000 weapon damage value. I honestly never dreamed of a day where I would see a build with 10k weapon damage, so I'm super happy I was actually able to push it over the 10k mark, and we go a little bit further than that, of course, because we have the Master's Bow, which is going to put us around 10,700 effective weapon damage, and there is a way that we can hit 11k plus, but we will get into that in just a sec. So taking a look at the Mundus, we yet again are the Warrior. We talked about this. Taking a look at the gear, it is yet again full Divines for that Warrior Mundus. Now, a few changes over the last spec here. The first big change is that we have the 2-piece Murkmire on for the Overkill. This is going to give us another 516 weapon damage when this ability procs. Huge stack coming out of this yet again, allowing us to push that huge value. The next set that we have is Clever Alchemist. Now, Clever Alchemist was picked because it is, quite simply put, tied with the Ravager set for the highest amount of weapon damage that you can get out of a 5-piece set in the game. We get the base 129 weapon damage on the 4-piece, and then when we drink a potion, we get an additional 661 weapon and spell damage for 15 seconds. So a massive amount of stat coming out of this. This is, of course, not something that you will have up all the time. However, for the sake of this video, this is how we hit that 10k value. And then finally, guys, the last set that we're using is the Ravager, and that is just like the Clever Alchemist because it gives us the highest base weapon damage in the game. 4-piece weapon damage, 5-piece when we deal a melee attack, we have an 8% chance to increase our weapon damage by 645. Now, this is tricky because, as you guys can see here, we've got a few sets together that we need to get to proc all together in order to hit that high value. And then, of course, the Brutality draining poison needs to proc as well. And then we need to light attack poison injection on our target too. So our effective weapon damage on this build is very, very good. However, it will not be that high all the time. I think realistically this build will be floating around 8 to 9k weapon damage on average, depending on how well you are proccing your abilities and your cooldowns. And then finally, guys, we have the Master Bow on the back bar here, and we had mentioned this in the last spec. Very important, I think, for the bow back bar, just to stack the highest effective weapon damage possible. And then for the traits, guys, we yet again have gone double Nirnhoned, Brutality draining poison, very important. We have the weapon spell damage enchant infused with our weapon damage yet again, and then full Divines with some max stam on this build too. Now, I had mentioned that you could actually push over 11k weapon damage on this build, and the way that you can do that is possible. However, it is a very finite set of circumstances that will allow you to do it. So here's how you're going to do it. Instead of running Murkmire, you'll run the Balorg set. Now, in the game, Murkmire is going to give you 516 base weapon spell damage when you use 2 light attacks in a row for 6 seconds. The Balorg will give you double the cost of your ultimate for 10 seconds in weapon and spell damage. However, if you guys have taken a peek around the skills, you'll quickly find out that most ultimates in the game are below 250 cost, meaning that Murkmire will give more base weapon spell damage than Balorg's will. Well, there's one ultimate in the game that is higher than 250 base cost. There's actually 2. One of them is Werewolf, and the other one is Vampirism's Bat Swarm. So these are the 2 ways that you can get over 11k weapon damage on this build. You're going to slot Balorgs, and you're going to have either Vampirism, Bat Swarm, or you're going to have Werewolf on your back bar. And essentially what you're going to do is fight another player who is using increased ultimate cost poisons, which will make your ultimate more expensive. You want to be a stage 1 vampire, so your Bat Swarm is as expensive as possible, and that will allow you to get over 500 base weapon damage from the Balorg set. If you have the increased cost Noston, you should be able to get over 600 base weapon damage on the Balorg set. So it will push us a little bit further. It'll push us into that territory of having 11k plus weapon damage, especially if we go for the Werewolf Ultimate in order to make that transformation occur. And here we go, guys. We throw on a set of Pelinals, and there you see we almost hit 9,000 weapon spell damage, and our effective weapon spell damage with the poison injection is going to be 9,400 plus. So there you go, guys. Just a fun little flip, throwing on the Pelinal set in place of either the Ravager or the Clever Alchemist. Now, this is yet again not going to be consistent buffs on this build, but to see 9k weapon spell damage on a hybrid, absolutely beautiful. And finally, guys, I won't be going over CP for these builds simply because it's not really important. The champion points actually have no influence over your weapon damage value. It's the same with or without CP. I did throw CP on this build for the sake of sustain, but the weapon damage is not changed or affected by it. Alright, so that wraps up the video today. I really hope that you guys enjoyed it, and I really hope that you maybe learned a little bit about stacking some weapon damage, and hopefully it helps you guys out with your builds in the future. Thank you so much for watching. If you guys want to send in community content to be featured, either a build or top 5 PvP commentary, you can send it in to KristoferESO@hotmail.com. And then finally, we are sponsored by What the Fast. They're a VPN for gamers. They give me better ping to ESO, and they are free to try. So thank you guys so much again, and I hope to see you next time.